give you a little bit of history of kind of how this started. We were getting questions from both directions, both bottom up from schools. How do we record certain virtual discipline, or how do we virtually discipline? And then also from the top up, from the feds, saying, how are you going to report certain discipline aspects for kids that are in your virtual setting? So we really kind of needed to make sure that we had a cohesive, agreed upon process throughout all of this. Aveen, if you could take me to the next slide, please. My name is Nicole, and I am just your JC here today. I am not the main show. I am just here to help these ladies get through their presentation today. And we have three wonderful offices: the Office of Special Education Services, the Office of Student Intervention Services, and the Office of General Counsel. So we have definitely come together at the department to work together on this particular presentation. And then also, as we are getting started, my job as a JC includes just a little bit of housekeeping. So please be sure you keep mute your mic. Mute your mic. And with the number of folks we have here in the presentation, I will turn off my camera once I am done speaking. It might help everything roll a little bit better, just because we do have a lot of participants here today. And then also we will be recording the presentation as well. Next slide, please. So the topics that we're going to that we're going to discuss today are definitions for ISS, OSS, and expulsions, how that looks in a brick and mortar setting, but then also how that might translate in a virtual setting, and the reporting requirements. We're going to talk about a couple of different scenarios, and then some very important reminders, especially from our Office of General Counsel. And with that, I will hand it over to our very first presenter.
Good morning. So our goal as educators is to create a positive school climate where everyone feels safe and respected. We know that when all students feel like they belong, they are more engaged, more motivated, and healthier, and they also achieve more. School climate permeates everything educators and students do and experience. Students need to know that adults care for them, genuinely believe in their potential, and have their best interests at heart. Let's take a look at some basic definitions related to suspensions and expulsions. Suspensions, out-of-school suspensions. Out-of-school suspensions are those instances in which a child is temporarily removed from his or her regular school for disciplinary purposes to another setting. This may include a home setting or a behavior center. This includes both removals in which no IEP services are provided, but the removal is 10 days or less, as well as removals in which the child continues to receive services according to his or her IEP. And then we also have in-school suspensions. And of course, those are the instances in which a child is temporarily removed from his or her regular classroom for disciplinary purposes, but remains under the direct supervision of school personnel. Direct supervision means school personnel are physically in the same location as students under their supervision. And of course, that could be physically and virtually. Next slide, please. Now, we also have expulsions, two types of expulsions. We have expulsions with educational services, and that includes removing a child from his or her regular school for disciplinary purposes and providing educational services to the child. This can be via home-based services or also transferring the student to an alternative educational setting. This is for the remainder of the school year or longer in accordance with the local educational agency policy. It also includes removals resulting from violations of the Gun-Free Schools Act and are modified to less than 365 days. We also have expulsions without educational services. And this refers to an action taken by the local education agency of removing a child from his or her regular school for disciplinary purposes and not providing educational services to the child for the remainder of the school year or longer in accordance with the LEA policy. It also includes removals resulting from violations of the Gun-Free Schools Act that are modified to less than 365 days. Then we have expulsions that are a result of zero tolerance policies. These are actions taken by the LEA of removing a child from his or her regular school environment for the remainder of the school year or longer because of zero tolerance policies. Zero tolerance policies are policies that result in mandatory expulsion of any student who commits one or more specified offenses. These offenses could involve guns or other weapons, or violence, or other similar infractions, or any combination of. I think it should be noted that a policy is considered zero tolerance, even if there are some exceptions to the mandatory aspect of the expulsion, such as allowing the chief administrating officer of a local education agency to modify the expulsion on a case-by-case basis. And here are just some examples of what a suspension might look like in a virtual environment. It may include limiting a student's audio or video, having a student report to a supervised alternative room, locking a student out of their class or other online forum, or blocking a student's access to email or the district's online platforms. And now passing on to the next presenter.
Next slide.
I'm not sure what's going on with Yolanda, but if everyone can hear me, I'm gonna take over. The discipline data reporting for the 2021 school year, schools are required to report the following in virtual learning environments: all suspensions and expulsions for all offenses, all in-school suspensions for all offenses, incidents and harassment incidents. So there's a portion of the discipline table 5 reporting for special ed where you have to report all incidents. The multidisciplinary categories, the table 5 report for the special ed report basically covers 6 components and by 4 categories. So districts are required to report the unilateral removals to an interim alternative educational setting by school personnel, or interim alternative education services removal by hearing officers, and that is your part 1 of the table 5 report. The third portion of that report, if you could mute your report, mute your recording.
And see, it keeps, for whatever reason, it keeps saying, oh dear, your call is dropped. It keeps dropping.
I'm not really sure what's going on, but someone's talking in the background. If you could mute your microphone, that would be great. The fourth portion of that covers all in-school suspensions. For your in-school suspensions and your out-of-school suspensions, that report actually looks at the total number of students that were suspended over 10 days. And then there's a portion that looks at the students that was suspended for less than 10 days. And then the next part of that report actually looks at all students that have been removed for whatever the reason is. So you're looking at all of your disciplinary removals for students. And for your table 5, once again, please remember that these are students with disabilities that have been removed from their regular educational environment for any disciplinary reasons. The sixth part of the report actually looks at expulsions, and this is the only portion of the report that actually covers gen ed students. So this particular portion looks at the total number of students that have been with disabilities that have been suspended, and it also captures the regular ed population number of suspensions. And for each of these multidisciplinary categories that I previously mentioned, you should report by disability, race, ethnicity, gender, and by limited English proficiency. Next slide, please. The reports, how should the counts be reported? Any students that have less than half-day suspensions, you do not report them. students who have at least a half-day suspension to 1.5-day suspension will be rounded up to 1-day suspension. I'm sorry, that should be instead of less than 1.5, it should say 1. So a half-day suspension to 1-day suspension is actually rounded to 1 day. 1.5 to anything 10 days is rounded to 2 to 10 days total. Anything greater than 10 days, those are your students that will actually be counted for indicators 4A, 4B. So that's where those numbers will appear, and that's for indicators 4A, 4B. When we're looking at significant disproportionality, we're looking at the number greater than 10 and the numbers less than 10. Next slide, please. Things for you to consider if you've never done this report before, or if you've had difficulties in the past. When reporting cohorts as a guide to determine the total number of students or incidents that needs to go into each box, ensure that your total numbers meet the disciplinary removal formula. Once you know the total numbers for each category, break down the number by disability, race, ethnicity, gender, and English second language, and that's your LEP students. Fill in the Table 5 report. We do have the report, the blank document, Table 5 spreadsheet posted on the website. So if you want to get an early start or just kind of start familiarizing yourself with that, we have that information posted on the website, and I will share the link in the chat with you so that you will have that information. Next slide, please. Okay, there you go. Data entry considerations. Please double check the followings before you submit your Table 5 report. The LEA name and date of the submissions is entered on Section A, page 1. There should be no missing or invalid values. Anything that is a potential error or blanks on the spreadsheet will be highlighted in red. Any red that you see on your spreadsheet is an error and will need to be corrected before you submit. Please, if you are having difficulties resolving your blanks or your errors, please let us know. You could contact myself, Carolyn Bostic, or Yolanda Singletary for assistance with these reports. Any computation discrepancies, we have the spreadsheets formulated so that it will automatically do the calculations for you. So if something is wrong or if you see red, please make sure that you complete the report to I think it's 15 tabs on that particular report. So as you populate the spreadsheet, there will be some errors. So make sure that the entire spreadsheet is actually completed and populated before you call to say, hey, we have errors. It is kind of misleading, but if you get stuck, please reach out to us and we will gladly assist you in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And provide any supporting information or clarifications in the comment section if necessary. Next slide. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to look at some discipline scenarios as it relates to the virtual school environment and some things that you may have encountered so far. Back in September of 2017, the Department of Education updated Regulation 43-279, which includes the Discipline Code of Conduct. And during that time, under those updates that were done, we looked at adding more interventions to suspensions and expulsions. If your district has not done those updates, this is a prime opportunity to do those updates. But most districts have done those updates and added more interventions and have created a matrix. And with that matrix is used to look at interventions before we do our recommendation for a suspension or an expulsion. So today, this is our interactive portion of the workshop in which we will ask you to put a couple answers into the chat box while you're participating. And we're going to go through a few scenarios. Before we go into those scenarios, we just want to talk about suspensions in a virtual environment. In a virtual environment, when you're suspending a student, that means you're limiting their virtual experience, meaning that those students are excluded from the setting with the other students that they usually are in that classroom with the other peers. That means that they don't have access at the same time or with the teacher. They may be off working on their assignments, but they are not included with the regular classroom setting. And once you've done one of those practices, we consider that an OSS, meaning that that would be considered for reporting as OSS because they don't have access to a teacher and it's related to a behavioral incident. And we want to make sure that's clear. So our first scenario that we're going to go through is that you use the chat box for this scenario to give answers. The first scenario, during a Google Meet session, a student posted inappropriate comments in the chat box. The student was given a warning from the teacher, but the student continued to post for the remaining of the remote session. What interventions can take place? I will give you a few minutes to type in what intervention school level that you have right now would take place during a scenario like this. I've seen one response come in so far. Yes. Turning the student's chat feature off, limiting the ability to access the chat feature, disabling the chat feature, talking one-on-one with the students. You see all those great interventions. Thank you. What are some of the possible disciplinary actions that can take place? I see we still have some of those interventions coming in. Great. Warning, phone call, parent contact, student conference. Limiting interaction. Okay, and parent is notified. So how does this look inside the virtual setting? So we're just going to go over to this document here that gives some examples. And some of you have provided great examples of things that we can use as interventions. And our goal is to continue to intervene during this time. It's very crucial that we intervene before we go to the automatic OSS or ISS. So I saw some great feedback coming through. Sometimes we have to reteach that behavior inside of that virtual learning environment. We have to reinforce the appropriate behavior. We have to provide that explicit instruction. And then teacher-student conferences on those days in which the teacher has their office days, they can have a conference with the student if this is an ongoing issue, contacting the parent. And then you can also do a teacher-parent-student conference. These are some of those interventions. So we want to make sure that we keep the interventions as the forefront as we move forward. So inside your student handbook, make sure that you're reviewing your interventions as it relates to the virtual learning environment. Make sure that you've updated your information to make sure that you have that information readily available and have explained that to parents. There are also some disciplinary actions that you can also have, and that's verbal reprimand, conference, ISS, OSS. In the virtual setting, you can do your telephone calls, you can have your virtual meetings, and all of those can be hosted through your Google Classroom, Zoom, Microsoft Teams. And then with your ISS for virtual environment, if you have an ISS person, you can have them host an ISS virtual session as well. And then make sure that you're reviewing the levels of those behaviors, which level 1 is the behavioral misconduct, and then your level 2, which is the disruptive conduct, which is level 2. And make sure it's aligned to your district policy. So that's just one example of a scenario. The other scenario, during a remote session, a student continues to interrupt instruction by unmuting their microphone and talking during that instruction. The student was given numerous warnings to mute their microphone. What interventions do you have in place right now that you would want to share with everyone in this situation? If you could add those into the chat box. I have a few people that have added, keep muting the student's microphone, take control, having those conferences, disable the mute for all students, and that the teachers can mute students. And that is great if you have that functionality that's working well. So what are some possible disciplinary actions that would take place? Someone says a conference with the student, rooms, and a one-on-one conference, phone call home, student conference, and those are the same things that we have added here. Some of the same things that are listed. Also, just as a reminder, if you had to do an ISS session in that virtual learning environment, please make sure it's supervised, but you would do some of the same things that you did in the prior scenario. And we won't go through them all because you also shared a couple great ideas. Also documenting information in Class Dojo. The other scenario, a discipline scenario. During a virtual session, a student displays an inappropriate object during that live session, and that object could be anything. What interventions can take place when a student is displaying an inappropriate object? If you could add some information in the chat. Turn off the camera. Block out. Disable their camera. With that being said, what possible discipline actions based on your district policy would be taken? Remove the student from the breakout session. Record the session. Disable the camera. Thank you all for sharing. Some of those examples that you've given us, very helpful. especially with disabling the actual camera. But make sure that when you're disabling the camera, that the students are still able to receive some of the learning materials. So some of the example interventions are already given here. Just look at your interventions to make sure that you have some interventions in place, that you have that teacher-student conference, parent-guardian contact, or if you're going to place the student in ISS, that it is supervised. And if you're going to suspend the student, make sure during that suspension time that the student can still receive some of that work. And our last scenario, during a remote session, the teacher sees an illegal substance in the student's possession. The teacher takes a picture or records that incident and writes a referral. What consequences can be taken during that? What consequences would be taken during an incident like that? If we could get some responses in the chat. Suspension up to an expulsion, contacting the SRO, parent, reporting it to the admin. Thank you for sharing. Just want to make sure that we don't leave out our alternative school referral. We still have the option to use our alternative school programs as well as a referral. Once you're done your hearing, you still have OSS. You still can create an intervention plan or a behavioral contract for that student, and especially if it's a level 3. Someone else added drug counseling referral. Definitely, you can add that as well. So these are just some of the things that we get questions on. So anytime you have an OSS or ISS, those are reportable offenses. And they are reportable for our report card, and it's reportable for our federal reports and state reporting. So we want to make sure that our first goal is to look at an intervention first, and then our second goal is to if we have to suspend or put a student in ISS, that we make sure we report those properly at that time. But those actions can take place in a virtual learning environment.
Good morning. This is Barbara Drayton, and I am going to touch base with regard to some reminders with regard to discipline in the virtual setting. And these things apply when students are in a brick and mortar setting, but we have to make sure that we're also following all of the federal and state requirements when we're imposing a disciplinary action for students when they're in our virtual settings or some type of distance learning. The first, with regard to state law, as it says, a local board or a district board may authorize or order the suspension, expulsion, or transfer of a student for criminal act, gross misbehavior, persistent disobedience, or violation of written rules established by either that local board or the state board of education. So you still have the authorities that have been granted under state law. When we get to section 59-63-220, which is on the next slide, these rules will apply to all students. So when we talk about that 10-day rule, a lot of times people think that it's something that's just limited to students with disabilities. But under South Carolina state law, we have a specific state statute that says that no board can give an administrator the authority to suspend a student from a teacher's class or from school in excess of 10 days for one offense and for not more than 30 days in an entire school year. Of course, when you're talking about students with disabilities, you would have reached a change in placement way before getting to 30 days, and those due process rights will have kicked in. But look at that second line. And one of the reasons I want you to pay close attention here to this second line is there were a lot of responses with regard to, in the virtual setting, for interventions, talking about locking out or limiting the kids' access to a particular class if that student engaged in an inappropriate behavior. You have to make sure that when you're limiting access, that is not an intervention unless you have a type of tiered approach and you have a behavioral intervention, and that's part of the intervention plan. Usually when you're limiting the kids' access to that particular class, is actually a disciplinary action. So with this second line, any district board may confer upon an administrative authority to suspend a student from a student's class. Okay, so you have to make sure that it says from a teacher's class or from school. A lot of people look at their 10 days and they're looking at how kids are being excluded, and they say, oh, it's 10 days from school. But it also, you're talking about a teacher's class, okay? And then it goes on talking about the last 10 days of the school year. But you need to make sure that you pay close attention and that you are keeping up with any of those scenarios where you're actually locking the kid out of class or you're limiting their access. And make sure, again, that those days are being recorded. Okay, on the next slide, again, and we're talking about limiting those days of suspension for a single offense. And that applies to all students, again, not just students with disabilities. And of course, when it's a student with a disability, once you reach the 10 cumulative days of disciplinary removal abilities, and it's cumulative. It's not, I have 10 days, then as long as I don't go over that 10 days, let me get another 10, and then I can do another 10. No, whether you do it consecutively or it's 10 altogether based on a series of different removals, once you hit that 10th day, then the due process protections and rules for changes in placement under the IDEA kick in, as well as don't forget about Section 504, because counting those disciplinary removals and those due process rights are also under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So whether the student has an IEP or a 504 plan, these rules apply with regard to changes in placement. And next slide. And this also applies regardless of whether the student is receiving in-person instruction, hybrid, or distance learning. So if the student is in a hybrid learning situation, you must ensure that you are tracking those days where a teacher is imposing a disciplinary action, both when that student is on site and when that student is engaging in distance learning. Next slide. Okay, here's another thing that I think that a lot of people have not really realized as they've worked through the changes in instructional delivery models for this year is notice. When you're locking students out and you're putting students with a facilitator, but you're removing that kid or blocking their access from their regular classroom, notice. Just like if Billy Bob was in person and you're counting those days and you're imposing a disciplinary action, you would be required to provide the parent with written notice. You must also provide that written notice for the virtual setting. And you must make sure then that these days are being logged and that communication applies. You have to also provide that opportunity for the conference with the parent or guardian. Make sure that you are complying with that during distance learning as well. And then the right to appeal those suspensions to the district board or an authorized agent who is most likely going to be your hearing officer. Here's another tip. Aveen was talking about your policies and procedures with regard to disciplinary actions. In addition to our federal and state laws that we typically think about, don't forget that it is very important that you develop policies and procedures for disciplinary actions with regard to removals from the virtual setting, or your administrators have a crosswalk between your current policies and procedures so that they understand what falls under what category. You know, you have your regular disciplinary policies and procedures, and those they most likely will work. It's just that everybody has to have an understanding of what this thing that's already spelled out looks like in the virtual setting, because you don't want to put yourself at risk of allegations of discrimination. Because if your administrators do not understand what this relates to, then it's possible that you could have administrators within your district giving a different outcome or consequence or disciplinary action for a similar type of offense, because one person thinks it's I'm not sure how this equates in the virtual setting, so I'm going to do this, and another person thinks, oh, it falls here, and they impose a different disciplinary action. So that communication has to occur internally so that everybody's on the same page to avoid those allegations of discrimination, because there's different types of disciplinary action because people aren't on the same page with regard to where something falls. And expulsion, if you're doing an expulsion, which is the next slide, you have to make sure that you provide those notices there, and that you provide, again, notice of the right to appeal. So going into the next slide, making sure that whether it's brick and mortar, hybrid, distance learning, that students are advised of their right to have legal counsel for a hearing, and that's all students, and that the decision from that hearing officer is issued within 10 days of the hearing. And what do you do if a parent says, I don't want a virtual hearing because I have processing issues? I want an in-person hearing because I need to show something and I'm limited with regard to technology. How is your board handling those particular requests? Because with regard to the discrimination issue, you have to provide that parent not just notice of a right to a hearing, but access to the hearing. So how are you handling those situations when the parent says, I would be limited with technology, or I don't know, I have an issue, I can't do this on the computer or using my phone, I want an in-person hearing? Make sure you have procedures in place with regard to that. Do you need an interpreter? You need to, the same as you would if it was in person, you have to make sure that you're going down your checklist with regard to the hearings. And again, making sure that appropriate notice of appeals are provided to the parent and the student. Next slide. Now, we've been talking about things that apply to all students. Now we're getting to specifically with regard to our students with disabilities. So when you have a student with a disability, whether it's an IEP or a 504 plan, again, you must make sure that you are appropriately documenting these removals, that you understand where it falls with regard to whether it's an intervention or whether it's a disciplinary action. There were some answers on interventions before about muting the student's mic. Before getting to that mic, muting the mic, what steps were taken prior to that? And what if that student has a behavioral intervention plan? For an additional scenario, let's say the student has a behavioral intervention plan, his IEP still references that behavioral intervention plan, and it says that student would have if that student was in person, that student would have had a one-on-one adult support person, giving that student both nonverbal cues and then verbal cues prior to any type of removal from the instructional setting. Okay, now this student is virtual. The parent is working. This student according to the IEP and your present levels, is impulsive and is displaying all of those same behaviors that the student would have displayed if they were in person. Now you lock the student out as the very first step. And let's say you're also now getting to a situation where the parent is saying, you've changed my child's placement. When you get to the manifestation determination review and you get to that second question about, is the behavior the result of failing to implement the IEP, how will you address that? So one of the things, and I'm throwing that question out because you need to know what students have a behavioral intervention plan or have things that would have been implemented in person, and how do you address the that may be necessary because that child is now in a virtual setting. The need for interventions doesn't go away simply with the fact that the student is not receiving face-to-face instruction or is only receiving face-to-face instruction on 2 or 3 days a week. So you must appropriately plan, otherwise you will have problems getting through that manifestation determination review. Again, the team has to get together and they have to rethink what are some appropriate interventions that will work in the virtual setting. And removing that kid from instruction is not an intervention, that is a disciplinary action and must be recorded as such. So again, you have to do this problem solving beforehand. Next slide. Because now if you end up with a change in placement for disciplinary reasons, you must again involve this IEP team. And the IEP team has to be involved in determinations and regarding what services that student will receive if there's a change in placement. And that includes if the student, say, was face-to-face, now you're moving this student to virtual, is that going to be appropriate for that particular student? It's not just, does the student have a device and they're sitting in front of the device, but access. And the U.S. Department of Education issued a guidance or policy question and answer document, however you'd like to refer to it, that says, yes, you can use a virtual platform for students with disabilities if you're using it for your students without disabilities. But then there's another question. Can the student actually access the instruction? It's not just, can you sit in front of a device and hear someone talking to you, but access, which means, can the student actually benefit from this particular type of instruction? And they also issued similar guidance with regard to our ELL students. Access. It's not just giving you a device. It's not just saying you can hear the teacher, but can you access instruction? And when you're talking about locking the student out or muting the student, what if it's the special ed classroom? And how is the student going to then, and the student doesn't have good written skills, writing skills? How is that student going to communicate when they have, when they don't understand something and they actually need assistance with something? You have to think about all of those things. And then if you're removing that student from us and you're imposing a change in placement and it's a student with a disability, you still have to ensure that that student receives their related services, post-secondary transition services. What if that student's IEP has counseling as a related service? Is the student receiving those particular services? You have to look at all of those things. They don't just go away because we are in a different time right now. Next slide. And then if it's a student with a disability, it's not just your regular notice, written notice that you have to provide under state statute. What about those procedural safeguards? And you have to keep in mind when you have to provide that additional notification if it's a student with a disability who has an IEP. Because in the IDEA, it says on the date that the decision is made to impose a disciplinary removal that constitutes a change in placement for a student with disability, then the district must notify the parent of that decision and provide parents the procedural safeguards notice. So you have to make sure, just as if that student was face to face and the parent was coming in the parent line, because they're not there now, how are you going to provide those procedural safeguards? And then our manifestation determination reviews. Just like with the disciplinary hearing, you may have a parent who says, I have limited access to technology, or I'm just challenged with using it. How do you conduct that manifestation determination review and provide the parent with that opportunity to participate? Because you still have to do all of those things. And then what about the student who wasn't previously identified? Remember, if you now suspect that student has a disability, you're still required to have a manifestation determination review. You know, your participants, you have to make sure that you're able to get the appropriate participants involved, whether that MDR is going to be face-to-face or whether it's going to be virtual. All of your timelines still apply, and you must consider data. Now, what additional data do you need to bring to the table now? Well, the observations from how that student was accessing education, switching from face-to-face to virtual, because that is additional data. So all of the, say if you have any of those situations, such as what we saw in the scenarios that Aveen provided you with, what interventions were you providing? What other behaviors were you witnessing? How was this student struggling, switching from one instructional platform to the other? And again, behavioral intervention plans. If one exists, how was it being implemented? And then based on the change in instructional delivery model, were revisions necessary for that BIP, and then did they occur? If you need to conduct a functional behavioral assessment, what additional data might be necessary based on the change in the instructional delivery model? And how are you going to collect this data? You may need to bring in your school psychologist to see how that data can be collected. Next slide. And then you making sure that parents get their notice that if they disagree with the results of the manifestation determination review, that parent still has a right not just to appeal the issue of guilt, but they can challenge that MDR result through an IDEA, expedited due process hearing. And that is not your district disciplinary hearing officer. That is a special ed due process hearing officer who's trained by the Department of Ed. So parents of students with disabilities still have two routes as far as hearings. I'm not saying my child didn't, I'm not arguing that my child engaged in this behavior, but I think it was related to the disability. So I want that hearing under IDEA, or vice versa. It might not have been related, the behavior in itself, but I don't think my child did this at all, or it didn't fall under this particular category. I want to appeal the disciplinary action that's being imposed. And so again, just making sure that you are aware of all of those rights under IDEA and Section 504, because parents of students with disabilities can file complaints with the Department of Education. They can, both at the state level or at the federal level, alleging discrimination. And so make sure that, again, all your staff are aware, and they can do that crosswalk between the act that's causing the student to be subject to the disciplinary code of conduct, and the disciplinary action that the student is receiving.
Thank you, Barbara. That was great information. Everybody has been giving some great information today. Hi, everyone. My name is Cheryl Fitz. I am from the Office of Special Education Services. Just wanted to take a minute or two to do some reflection. We've heard some good information today, but we would like to know the major takeaways. What were your thoughts on what's been shared? What do you think needs to be reiterated? Something that needs to be shared with other people? So what I have put in the chat is the link to a Padlet. It will take you to another web page where you can fill out the information just make a brief comment on any section of what has been shared so far today, be it the positive school climate, even the definitions of suspensions, brick and mortar versus virtual, any major takeaways from the reporting, any major takeaways from what Barbara has shared, even from the discipline scenarios. Tell us what your thoughts are. And if you're having difficulty getting to that Padlet, feel free to write your responses in the chat. And give you a few minutes to do that. One of the comments says, these are great, and this is under discipline scenarios. These are great. I think it's important for administrators to look at the discipline scenarios and collaborate on how they would handle them. In my district, they would definitely be beneficial. I also have a comment under procedural reminders. Major takeaway from the discussion are the number of days that you have to complete calendar days or school days. And also, if someone has made a comment and you wholeheartedly agree, you can just click that heart and like the comment. For positive school climate, someone said a major takeaway is that our focus needs to be on keeping kids in school. And then we also have a couple of questions, which we will definitely address. One of them, do you have any thoughts or advice in regards to discipline for students who refuse to do their work? Another, can you discuss when an administrator moves a student to temporary remote instruction as a disciplinary consequence and how to code that? So yes, we will definitely get to those questions, and thank you for commenting. There's some good things here. We appreciate what you're sharing. If you also would like to, please share your aha moment. When we first started looking at this, an aha moment for me came when they said, we were discussing it, and it was determined that if a child is placed in a breakout room, that could be considered ISS, especially if you have someone supervising that breakout room. So what was your aha moment? Being reminded that 10 days is not just a SPED thing, but it's for all students. Thank you so much for sharing, guys. These are some great comments. We appreciate these things that you're sharing. Your takeaways, your food for thought. And on that same Padlet page, you will see at the very last column, something in the future. What would you like SCDE to consider? And that was one of the comments for the 10 days, being reminded that 10 days is not just a SPED thing, but for all students. Not reporting less than half-day suspensions, etc. So these are things you'd like for us to consider. Is there any training that you'd like for us to consider? Any particular topic of training? Anything that is needed that we have not yet done for you? If you would include that in the food for thought column, that would be much appreciated. One thing that I do have here, I'm not necessarily going to share, but it's a video clip. When you get this, when you get the copy of this presentation later on, you'll see a link to a brief video, about 2-3 minutes, where it says the child suspended from school's remote learning. The remote learning option makes headlines. Just to give you, it was an 8-year-old child whose brother came in the room with a BB gun. The child removed the gun from the brother and placed it to his side. Well, zero tolerance policies placed the child under expulsion, then went to suspension, and now they're in court. So just something for you guys to think about. I think what came to me from that particular video is to remember that we need to think about the full child. We need to think about everything that's going on, virtual settings. Don't forget why we're in virtual settings, COVID, what's going on at home. Let's just remember that we're here for the children and make the right decisions in what we're doing. Okay, Nicole? I think
Sorry,
now
I couldn't get my button fast enough, and then
Okay,
I've got enough screens. I lost my mouse. I was freaking out. I believe Cheryl covered just about everybody's questions. There is going to be, this training will be available, but then also we have in the next couple of slides, don't go there yet, next couple of slides, we do have some other presentations that are available for you to use with training and or for your teachers to use in the classroom to set appropriate expectations. There's some really great stuff, but we wanted to be sure that you guys also had these wonderful ladies' contacts. Aveen Coleman is in our OSIS and definitely is the one who's pulling down all of our data for EdFacts, for your report cards, for any, she is who OSIS goes to for a lot of our data regarding discipline. And then Yolanda Singletary is in the Office of Special Education Services. She's having some technical difficulties today. You did not hear from her. You heard from Carolyn Bostic, but Yolanda absolutely can answer all of your questions or your needs. Next slide, please. So these two resources are the ones I was just talking about. Not only will we have this recording and this PowerPoint available, but this top resource here is if you wanted to do a training with your entire staff. They walk through, they call it the SOAR method, and they give you SOAR like fly, not SORE like it hurts. Some really good stuff in there about training either your teachers or even your administrators, just about how to set in a virtual setting, what they should expect or not expect, or what's reasonable or not reasonable. It's a great presentation. And then that bottom one is, PPIS definitely suggests a lot of setting appropriate expectations and clear expectations with students. That second one is the actual expectations that a teacher can room and or a family can post in their home to be used during virtual classes. So some really great stuff there. And then next slide. Here are also a couple of other different data collection resources that you can find on our website. And finally, thank you guys very much. We certainly appreciate your time as we are navigating through these very interesting times. For those of you who had some difficulty seeing the slides throughout, we will definitely be posting the slides as well, or the full presentation. And we thank you all for joining us today, and we will set you free back to your world. Ladies, do we know where this information will be posted?
We did have a few questions, Nicole, that came through.
Okay.
We want to make sure we covered those. Someone asked about if they did remove a student, how would they code them? If you're using incident management, if you've removed the student for OSS or an ISS placement, you would code them the same. You would make sure you go into that incident, include the behavior, and then add the action. And the action would either be the OSS or ISS. And then you would include the number of days. If it's 3 days that they're going to have limited access to their virtual environment, meaning that they're going to be excluded, that would be considered an OSS. If they're going to be placed in ISS where they're going to be supervised, that would be considered an ISS placement. And you would add that in the system just like you would do in the brick and mortar environment. I saw that question inside the chat, and I don't know if there were any others that we wanted to give them a few minutes to ask, and the presentation will also go out in an email based on who registered. And then once we get the recording back, we'll send that information as well. Are there any other questions? Because I wanted to make sure we had enough time for questions, just in case someone has a burning question or an issue that they wanted us to address before we give you that time back. Nicole, I know that Cheryl said she had a few questions inside her packet. I just want to make sure we covered those as well.
Okay. Yes.
AV,
I'm sorry.
AV, which question did you just answer? Because I do see another one in the chat. Did you answer? Can you discuss when an administrator moves a student to temporary remote instruction? Is that what you just answered?
Yes.
Okay, here's another one. What is your recommendation for virtual students participating in classes when recommended for expulsion and waiting for hearing?
That is fine, as long as that is fine. A student can participate in classes, but that needs to be consistent.
There's a couple of questions in the Padlet earlier, Aveen. Do you have any thoughts or advice in regards to discipline for students who refuse to do their work? And also, could you address students who come to their virtual classroom late almost every day and or leave early before class is over?
The area in which addressing students who don't complete their work, the department sent out some information about students who were not actively attending school. There's an initiative there where you can refer those students to that new initiative, and there's a coach that would follow up with those students. I don't have the note right in front of me, but I can definitely send that information. It went out about a couple weeks ago, and they have coaches that work with students who have limited engagement. I think it's the Gate Grad Initiatives. I need to get the exact terminology, and I'll type that in here. But during that process, the kids are assigned a coach who follows up with them to ensure that they're logging in, doing their work. If you look at some of our virtual school programs that are operating statewide, when they're having difficulties with students not logging in, not turning in work, they have a coach that works with those students as well. So that's one strategy to start an intervention for those students, by assigning a coach if that's possible, or having your ISS person who may not have as many students work with those students and reach out to those students. So that's a strategy. And I'll also send some additional information of some of the coaching pieces that you'll see in our virtual charter schools statewide. But it is a good strategy to link those students up with someone who's going to be contacting them, reaching out to them on a daily basis. And what was the other question, Cheryl?
It was similar, but it was asking about a child who leaves early or arrives late.
Okay. As a reminder, in our attendance, you're flipping my hats into attendance and tardies. For virtual learning, it's difficult for us to gather tardy information. We ask that districts look at their policies, that most of you have some policy that states that a student must be in attendance 50% of the class period. If they're in attendance 50% of that class period, then they're marked present. In the virtual environment, it's hard to capture tardies because we don't know if that tardy is because my internet dropped when I was logging on, or I was kicked out a portion of the session. So it's very difficult to capture tardies and realizing that the student was in class for 50% of the time. It's more realistic And because the tardy code inside our attendance code is a present code, it also overwrites our SCVTP, which is our virtual present code. So we ask that you look at that situation a lot differently in the virtual learning environment. But when you're back in the brick and mortar environment, you can look at all of your attendance codes. It's just that when we're in the virtual environment, it's a lot difficult because we don't know what's causing that student to be tardy. Is it because they logged in late, or is it because the computer or internet was failing?
Okay, I have another question. Is there documentation of the provision of services to students with disabilities during ISS? How do you document that student? How do you document that the student was afforded the opportunity to continue to appropriately participate in the general curriculum? And there's another question connected to it. How do you document?
Cheryl, this is Barbara. I put those there in reference to a question that was above, and those are some of the things that, some of the questions that need to be asked when they're looking at whether it's an OSS or an ISS.
Okay, thank you, Barbara.
And I want to thank a couple of the folks that add the Engage SC with the Graduation Alliance. If you have not heard of that yet, thank you, Dr. Coakley, Ms. Broomfield, and Kelly Brown for adding those. It couldn't come, I haven't worked with it in a couple of weeks. I've been in data mode for the last couple of weeks, and so that's the name of the group, Engage South Carolina with the Graduation Alliance. If you have not, if your district is not involved with that, please reach out to someone at your district office to see if they have a population that they're working with. And that's a perfect opportunity to re-engage your students. Any other questions?
Just before you end, there was a question in reference to whether or not the presentation would be posted, and it is our intent to have it posted on the OSIS webpage and also under Aveen's information.
Thank you, Carolyn. Any other questions before we end the meeting?
Can I remind everybody to please go to the top of the chat and fill in the poll asking your position in the district?
Cheryl, do y'all see any other questions coming through?
I don't see anything. Barbara's answering a question now.
Shannon O'Neill. I see one in the chat box.
If an administrator removes a student from face-to-face to virtual indefinitely, does this get coded as an OSS, ISS, or a change of placement? IEP team did not propose the change, completely admin driven. Barbara, did you answer that question for her?
Okay. Well, with regard to that, you still must look at the IEP and see, can that student receive all of the services in their IEP and still access general ed curriculum with moving the student from face-to-face to the virtual setting. And the fact that the IEP team has not met to look at the appropriateness of this change, this could very well be a change in placement, because the IEP team has not been involved in looking at the appropriateness of this change and to ensure that the IEP can be implemented in the new setting and that the student can actually access the instruction.
Thank you, Barbara. Does anyone know if this gets coded as an OSS or ISS? Well, it's more than likely a change of placement, I think, so Barbara was saying, but
yeah, that's why the IEP team needs to meet to look at, can the student still participate in the general curriculum? Is the IEP still being implemented? What if that student had a behavioral intervention plan? But either way, it's a violation of the IDEA if the IEP team hasn't met, because it will depend on how those questions are asked during the process.
Okay, thank you.
Because it's possible that the student was face-to-face because there was a determination that the student couldn't access or benefit from online instruction, which would definitely then make it an exclusion.
Nicole, I think we're done with all the questions. Are you going to give us that final closeout?
Well, and I started to, but then you got me. No, it just thank you everyone for all that you do and the time that you dedicated today and the time that you spend every day. We definitely appreciate everything and all that you do, and keep up the good work. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact Aveen and Yolanda, and we look forward to speaking with you all if you have any needs. Thank you.